Social realism is the art movement that Mao was using for his pieces. So, it's social realism, to be very clear about this movement, when we talk about it in reference to um, Russian artwork, Chinese artwork, German artwork during this time, it's different than you would speak about social realism in America. So, there is a social realist movement that occurs in America in the 1930s, but their subject matter was more based around Depression era politics in America. So if you're studying social realism, it is important to note the difference. When you look at it in China, Russia, Germany, etc., these countries that were influenced by Marxist ideology, it is used as a propaganda tool, a government tool, to basically support and display the ideas of the state, let's say. You will notice it is always about a narrative, basically. It always uses figuration or people. It's very much about a realistic rendering or presentation of people doing things or people representing something. But at the same time, that it's called social realism, a lot of what it's really showing you isn't truly real. It's propaganda again. So it was a way of trying to indoctrinate or place a message in people's minds about the will of the state, the will of Mao, the will of the Cultural Revolution, the will of the People's Republic of China, and the overall communist message, right, that the state wanted to show to you. And as I mentioned before, there's always sort of three categories of people that are being stressed in these artworks: the idea of the worker, right, the idea of the peasant, right, the idea of the soldier. So if you actually look at the first three figures here, right in the front of the artwork that I'm showing you as the sort of opening slide, you'll notice that there is the worker, then you have the peasant. Notice the peasant's holding a sheath of grain on their shoulder, and then the soldier behind them. So right there you have the three people, right, that Mao said are the basis of his society. The worker, the peasant who would usually work in the fields, so they were all about agriculture, and then the soldier who protected the interests of the state, essentially. Um, and the two things that Mao really stressed was agriculture and technology. Over and over again, he said those two things had to walk hand in hand together if China was going to be a strong culture, if they're going to create a culture that could withstand. You had to have agriculture to feed the people, and you had to have technology to advance and promote, industry and advancement. So you had to have those two ideas sort of hand in hand with each other. The artwork is fascinating. It's some of my favorite to look at. It's some of my favorite to discuss. And again, I have a large academic background in this discipline, so I'm always reminded of what drew me to it in the first place when I was doing my master's thesis and writing about the connection of this work to a particular contemporary artist who used very similar thematics and approach. I learned so much about Chinese government and society and Russian government society and so forth by studying these artworks from the 20th century and thinking about where they were trying to go with this ideology. Mao, again, was using these artworks as pure propaganda. He called it the Great Leap Forward. And everything is tailored to tell his people that they are equal, right? They are working together, right? That they are prosperous because of their unity. Now, of course, if you know how this culture actually runs, you know that hierarchies quickly developed. But the propaganda doesn't show you that. It never shows you that. All it shows you is Mao lording over the people and granting them this prosperous society where the worker, the peasant, and the soldier were always going to be celebrated, and always going to be the ones who are the foundation of the culture. This imagery also always stresses unity and prosperity and happiness. So maybe behind the scenes, again, people didn't really want to follow this ideology, but that's not something you could show on the surface. You had to go along with the state or you'd be purged. So the propaganda always says you're happy, you're unified, you're smiling, you're holding hands, and look how good life is, right, in Mao's China. Look at the little kids going off to school. look at the prosperous worker, look at the, industrious peasant. And we have Mao to thank for that. We have Mao to thank for our equality, our prosperity, and our happiness, our unity. It's propaganda on the highest level. Um, I love this painting. It has a very realist, naturalist feel to it. If you know the realist movement, you can go look at like Courbet, Manet, and there's a lot of influence from that to this. However, realists, if you know Courbet or you know Manet, they were really painting real things. Courbet's famous quote was, "Show me an angel and I'll paint you one." Just let you think about that for a minute. Show me an angel and I'll paint you one. So they didn't paint anything that wasn't real. So it looks very realist, but we know, again, it wasn't. For instance, let's think about this, right? Would Mao ever really show up, do you think, at the site of a mine, which is what we're visiting here? We see all the people in the mine. Would he ever show up there and just walk amongst the people? Probably not. So it's a fantasy, right? Would the people be smiling and happy and running after him and just, I mean, no, probably not. Again, this is hard work. Look at the people in the back with the pickaxes above their heads, mining whatever it is out of the ground. But, the people in the forefront, along with Mao, seem to stress that happiness, prosperity, not a care in the world, no backbreaking labor, just all is good, right? Under the auspices of Mao. Another good painting to go look at if you want to compare it to this painting is Napoleon at the Pest House of Jaffa, which is a famous romantic work by the artist Gros. And in Napoleon at the Pest House at Jaffa, there's a similar sort of feel to it where Napoleon is in the painting as if he's visiting plague victims. And I always say to my students, do you think he ever went anywhere near these plague victims? And they're like, of course not. I'm like, it's brilliant propaganda, isn't it? I always say that these kind of works are like what you see on TV now if you watch a news channel. It's all about your spin, as we say. What kind of spin do you want to put? Because, let's face it, today it's not about what facts you have, it's how you spin them to somebody, how you spin that message to them. People aren't all that interested in factualness anymore. And as a professor, that's intriguing to me to say the least, because again, it's no longer about are you right or are you wrong, it's about how are you packaging it, and is it consumable to the person you're packaging it to? Do they want to swallow it or not? Make your packaging better and you'll get that person to consume your message, right? Make sure you put a little sugar on it, right? Mao knew how to create very, very convincing messaging, even if we know under the surface of the messaging, it wasn't exactly the truth. This is another famous painting from Mao's time, one of my favorite to talk about, Mao with the people of the world. He's so benevolent, so caring, so kind, and are surrounding him are these various peoples from various countries. Now, often my students are like, why are they from certain places? I'm like, well, you have to think about what time this is. Mao took power at basically around the time of World War II. And so if you really look at the people that he's with, it was very much the unclaimed nations, we might say. The nations that weren't allied yet. And Mao and the Chinese felt that these are perhaps countries that were ripe for the picking as far as an alliance was concerned. So, as Africa was sort of unclaimed alliance-wise, a lot of South, Central, Mesoamerican countries. So if you really look at the ethnicities or the background of the people in the painting, it's people that he probably felt he could align himself with who were unclaimed. People from the Middle East, for instance. So that is what's being represented in this painting. Him as a bold uniter and unifier, right, and benevolent man. Again, not sure that's really all the truth. A prominent way that art was made that was much more affordable, much more accessible to most people in China was the poster. So the works I showed you previous to this, I was trying to group all the paintings together because I wanted you to think about that those were more unique objects. But the way that the state truly communicated was through the poster. Because you could tack it up on a wall, you could buy it and hang it in your home, and these were cheap, easy pieces to produce, to replicate, to sell, to own. This is very similar to printmaking. If you look at the use of printmaking in Europe, right, it was a cheap and easy way to make art and a cheap and easy way to get your art into people's hands. If you research, for instance, like museums that do shows, exhibitions, right, on Chinese poster art, often they'll have holes in them, from where people just tacked them up on the walls. These were usable utilitarian objects that were found in people's lives. So for me, I find that extremely fascinating. I love art that's about how do you hit as many viewers as possible? Because, I'm an art historian, but I'm well aware that most art is way too expensive for most people to really own or be around or live around. And so I've always had a real fascination with art for the people, posters, cartoons, design, those kind of things, because I think that those are the things we see in our daily life. And it's a very insidious way, an easy way to try to get a message into people. Use advertising, use goods that everyone has to buy, use things that are cheap and affordable, and you can really sort of transmit your message so very easily to whoever's around. So posters were really where we see them excel. And again, if you look at the posters, you'll notice the same themes being replicated over and over again. The soldier, the worker, the peasant. Here in this one, you can see the typical Maoist uniform of a soldier of this time, the green and the red. Red is considered a revolutionary color and was considered the color of China. So red is everywhere. If you look at Chinese imaging, it shows up all the time as a power color. And if you know anything about feng shui, you know that red in feng shui is all about power and energy and drama, and it's used so much in China because it symbolizes that. But again, people talk about feng shui wise, it actually makes you quite agitated. Like, you're not really ever supposed to like paint your bedroom red unless you never want to sleep again. Guess that's up to you. But it's this energetic color that, gives energy and gives movement. This is a wonderful one. Again, the three classes of the people, the peasant, the worker, right, the soldier. And notice that everyone's always happy. Everyone's always unified. It's always the same thing. Here, little red book. We all have our little red book. Of course we've read everything you've said, Chairman Mao. How could we not? You're everything to us. You're the sun that shines down, right? You're the end point of the lineage of Maoist thinking and Maoist philosophy, right? You give us our strength, right? You give us our purpose. If it's starting to feel a little cult-like, I'm hoping it is. And this is why when people talk to me about government and like leaders and how they're framing everything, I always have a very like bad feeling about certain stuff. If people start to, have a little too much propaganda, I just start to think back to these images, and I know how easy it is to convince the masses of something. I'll just leave it there. Something, right? If you get in their heads enough, if you tell them enough, that these people are after you, right? Or you'll be safer if you do this, right? Um, it gets insidious. They've done psychological studies where if you repeat something often enough to somebody, even if it's a lie, they say about 20 times. If you can say it to them 20 times, over and over, even if it's a lie, they'll start to think it's the truth. Their brain will start to go, well, I've heard that so much. Maybe there's some validity to it. So again, as someone who teaches art history, looks at government, looks at propaganda, I get a little twitchy sometimes when I see certain things out there in the news, and I can be like, uh-oh, here we go, right? And I'm not one to believe that America can't fall to this type of influence because, again, it's all just about conditioning over time. This is one of my favorite posters where literally you have the line of the lineage from Marx and Engels. And by the way, Marxism is Marx and Engels. They wrote the original, Communist Manifesto, but I always joke the poor Engels, he gets left out. Maybe his beard wasn't as beautiful as Marx's, right? I don't know. And then you move to, of course, Stalin, Lenin, to Mao. And so again, it's sort of tracing this lineage up to, dear leader, right? Here at the end. And the cult of Mao, as we call it, was intense. It's still rather intense today because nothing has changed in China, technically. When I was there, it was 1997, which was actually the year that Hong Kong went back to China, so it was a very politically loaded year. for obvious reasons. And the cult of Mao was still very prominent even then. You could buy the little red book, you could buy the little hats with the stars on them. I smoked at the time, so I bought a little lighter with Mao on it. It was a red lighter, had Mao on it. And when you opened it to light your cigarettes, it played the communist national anthem. It was fantastic. When I took it home, people were like, oh my God, that's whoa. And I'm like, I know, right? So Maoist. And again, it was something that was prominent in their culture. Right after I left, right, around 2000, from then on, I think China has more migrated to a capitalist communism, as we call it. The communism is still part of the state mechanism, but if you look at the way that they're using money in industry, it's become much more capitalistic. So those of us who study China talk about they're kind of a communist capitalism. They're this hybrid of the two together now, where you have state control of so much, but they love money and they love building things and they love technology and they love industry. So they're sort of at this interesting place. But again, the cult of Mao still reigns supreme, right? Beloved Mao, we are loyal to you forever. This is my favorite. Chairman Mao is the red sun in our hearts. So this might look very old-fashioned to us, but if you know China today, it's still something that guides them as far as their propaganda. To speak out negatively against Mao and their culture still today would probably earn you a prison sentence. To say that you're religious would get you thrown in jail. I remember when I was living in China, trying to ask the people who were, cooking our meals or, tending to us, and I was interested in their culture, but I'd be like, "Are you Buddhist?" And they would just look severely uncomfortable. One of the people who was from America, who was traveling with us, but from China originally, was like, "You need to stop asking them about their religion." And I was like, "Why?" And they were like, just staring at me, and I was like, oh, like they weren't supposed to talk about their religion. Everyone sort of knows there's these people that are Buddhist, obviously, in China, but they don't speak about it. So the idea of, there was a phrase when I was there, like, tie your tongue. They were very hesitant about talking to outsiders. Like, I didn't view it. I viewed myself as a curious person asking curious questions and intellectual questions, but they were like, you're an outsider. You're not, I don't know if I should trust you. Are you going to run back to the state? Like, you're from America. You're here under, basically, I had to have a visa through the government to be there. You can't just go to China, by the way. You have to have a visa to be there. You have to be allowed in by the state. And they were like, well, first off, I don't know if you're going to go run back and tell the state. And then someone was like, and you really shouldn't ask these questions, because what if the state throws you out for asking about these things? And I had never really, as American with so many freedoms and rights, I was like, oh, yeah. Like I was reminded of this when we were going to be there when Hong Kong returned to China and we were going to be in Beijing. And I said, well, can we go down to like Tiananmen Square and watch? And we were like, no, they cannot see any Americans. They cannot see you because, again, people are very torn about this, and this is something that's very hot button. And you think you're just curious, but you're in the middle of something that is beyond you politically that you're not a part of. So I'd love to go back to China today and really see where they've come to, again, with more of their embracing of capitalism, but knowing full well from studying their culture up until this present moment that they're still a state-run agency. For instance, like Twitter is banned there. Any type of free speech is banned. Everything goes through dear leader, the sun, right, Mao, shining down right on all of us. And this is what the last poster I show you in reference to what side you were on, who were you allied with, where, it was a way of saying the Asian way was better, the communist way was better, right? You don't want to think about Western ideology, it's not for you. So again, Mao has used his propaganda to seep into almost everything. I wanted to show you how the Maoists would dress, right? How the cultural warriors would dress. Pins and memorabilia related to Mao were very, very common. Like the man in the image, they'd often collect these. Again, when I was in China, there were markets where they would sell these and you could sell them. So I actually had like a jean jacket that I actually decorated with Maoist pins that I wore when I got home, like with a little dress underneath. I would wear this kind of pin cover. Now I just have the pins, but it was like this pin covered dress. It was very, very cool. You could, you can always kind of look at these photos and paintings and see that they would wear these very militaristic outfits, the Red Guard outfits as they were called. The one with the woman is very striking, where she has her red book, of course. She's wearing the cap with the red star on it. So this was the uniform that they would use to sort of identify themselves and show themselves to each other. One interesting note I'll make about like the genders. Many people actually praised Mao because he was about gender equality, where he allowed for women to become Red Guards and to go into that type of service. And so many people celebrated the gender neutralness, right, of communism. So again, a lot of people talk about the ills of communism, but many scholars talk about, well, women were allowed to do the exact same thing as men. So isn't that good? Isn't that something you would praise? So notice that these arguments about good and bad are not always as simplistic as maybe we would like to make them at the end of the day. And then this startling photo, of course, of all the Red Guards, right? This is a photo from the 80s, actually, all holding up their red books. So, people are often like, Mao's a symbol of the past. I'm like, no, he's really not. And this is something I'll end on as a thought. So, a couple years ago, it became kind of trendy to wear communist garb. I saw this on like Instagram and different places, and I was like, oh Lord, oh boy. Where it became very popular for influencers and fashionistas and different people to start buying the caps, the Mao caps, and wearing them, or buying T-shirts with Mao on them and wearing them. And then people were getting kind of ticked, rightly so, especially Chinese people that saw this. They were like, you're basically you're turning a man who killed like 2 to 5 million people into a fashion icon. And do you even understand who he is or what he was about or what he stood for? So it became this very heated argument about, again, cultural appropriation. Like, do you understand what you're doing? I look back even to when I came back from China in '97, and the lighter, the jean jacket, those kind of things. For me, I was celebrating what I had learned about Chinese culture and my connection to it. But looking back, maybe some people who were Chinese who saw me were probably pretty offended and thought, why are you using tokens of my culture as part of your fashion statement? But for me, it meant only positive things. It meant, I learned so much by living for 3 months in this culture about who they were. But, again, to them, it could have been very, very much scorned. I joke all the time that thank God I didn't grow up in the age of Instagram, where you can instantly post something that you're like, that's not what I meant. But, uh, you know. So again, being on this earth for 44 years, I'm fascinated with how you can always learn more, how things change over time, how you use culture, the influence of culture can change over time. And again, the journey of that for me has been rather interesting. And I'm still left at the end of the day looking at Mao as a figure, again, his legacy, and thinking about, as we are now in the 21st century, what does this mean for China as they move forward? Will they continue to grasp on to the little red book, right? And how long will that go on? Or will they transition to a more capitalist, truly capitalist ideology over time? I guess only time will tell. But I hope you enjoyed looking at the propaganda of Mao, because it is one of my favorite things to talk to you about in the course.